The date is June 9, 1982, and the location is the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, a narrow, fertile strip of land sandwiched between two towering mountain ranges, where the air is thick with the heat of Earth. It is an integrated network of 19 surface-to-air missile batteries, overlapping and interlocking, to create a zone of absolute denial, and they believe that they have solved the problem of air power, and that the era of the manned fighter jet is over, and the era of the missile has begun. The Soviet general traces his finger across the map, pointing to the symbols representing the SA-2 guideline missiles, designed to kill high-altitude bombers, and the SA-3 Goa missiles, designed to intercept medium-altitude attackers. And most importantly, he points to the pride of the Soviet export arsenal, the 2K-12 Kub known to NATO by the terrifying code name SA-6 Gainful, which is a mobile killer mounted on a tank chassis, carrying 3 missiles that look like fingers pointing at the sky, ready to snatch any aircraft that dares to fly below 20,000 feet. The general smiles and tells his Syrian counterparts that if the Israeli Air Force tries to enter this valley, they will be committing mass suicide, because he believes the laws of physics and the density of his fire control solution make survival impossible. But 60 miles away, in an underground command center in Tel Aviv, the mood is very different, for there is no arrogance here, only a cold, hard determination born of trauma. To understand why the Israelis are about to launch this attack, we must travel back 9 years to the catastrophe that nearly destroyed their nation, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In October 1973, the Israeli Air Force, the undisputed masters of the Middle East skies, flew into a technological ambush. As they raced to support their tank crews in the Sinai Desert, they were met by a weapon they had never seen before, the SA-6, which, unlike the older clumsy missiles, used a continuous wave radar illuminator that the American-made radar warning receivers on the Israeli F-4 Phantoms could not detect. The pilots were flying blind and didn't know they were being tracked until they saw the telephone pole-sized missiles erupting from the sand, causing horrific carnage. In the first 3 days of the 1973 war, the Israeli Air Force lost dozens of aircraft as Phantoms and Skyhawks fell from the sky like autumn leaves, and the pilots who survived were shaken to their core, calling the missile belt the missile wall, which forced the Israeli Air Force to stop providing close air support, effectively leaving their ground troops to fight and die alone. The shock of 1973 changed the Israeli military psyche forever, and they swore a blood oath that never again would they be blind, and never again would they let a Soviet missile battery dictate the terms of the battle. For 9 years, while the Soviets were patting themselves on the back and selling the SA-6 to every client state from Baghdad to Damascus, the Israelis were working in the shadows, creating a secret research division dedicated solely to the destruction of surface-to-air missiles, by analyzing the wreckage of the SA-6s captured in 1973. They dissected the electronics and found the frequencies, discovering that the Soviet strength was also their fatal weakness, because the Soviet system relied entirely on active radar, meaning to see the enemy, the radar had to scream electromagnetic energy, and if you scream in the dark, you can be found. The Israelis developed a concept of operations that was so radical most Western military analysts dismissed it as science fiction, involving the synchronization of 3 distinct technologies that had never been used together in combat. The first was the UAV, the unmanned aerial vehicle, which in the early 1980s were considered toys, small plastic airplanes with lawnmower engines used for target practice, and the Soviet High Command laughed at them, unable to conceive that a toy could threaten a superpower. But the Israelis took these toys, the Scout and the Mastiff, and fitted them with television cameras and radar reflectors, turning them into bait. The second technology was the standoff anti-radiation missile provided by the Americans, like the AGM-78 Standard Arm and the AGM-45 Shrike, along with the Israeli-built ground-launched version called the Kerez or Ziev, which were massive rockets that could be fired from the back of a truck, miles away from the battlefield, designed to home in on a radar beam and ride it down to the source. The third and most secret component was electronic warfare, where the Israelis took massive Boeing 707 airliners and stripped out the seats, filling them with banks of computers, jamming transmitters, and signal analyzers designed to blind the enemy, communications creating a fog of war so dense that the Syrian commanders wouldn't be able to talk to their own troops. On that June morning in 1982, the trap is finally ready to be sprung, and the operation is codenamed Mole Cricket 19. A strange name for a battle that will decide the future of air warfare. The Syrian forces in the Bekaa Valley are on high alert, knowing the Israelis are coming and having their radars warm and their missiles on the rails waiting for the roar of jet engines. But instead, they hear the buzzing of lawnmowers. The first wave of the Israeli attack does not consist of F-15s or F-16s, but consists of dozens of small fiberglass drones drifting over the ridgelines of the Lebanon mountains, which are slow and non-threatening. But on the radar screens of the Syrian SAM batteries, they look exactly like fighter jets because the Israelis have fitted the drones with Lüneburg lenses, special radar reflectors that magnify their radar signature. To the nervous Syrian operators staring at their green glowing scopes, it looks like a massive Israeli air armada is beginning its attack run, and the Soviet advisors in the command bunkers see the blips and follow their doctrine to the letter, determining that a target is a target, and the order goes out to the 19 SAM batteries in the valley to turn radars on. This is the moment the Israelis have been waiting for. And this is the fatal mistake because as the Syrian radars switch from standby to active mode, they begin to emit high-power pulses of electromagnetic energy lighting up the valley floor electronically, like a Christmas tree, so the location of every single radar van, every single guidance dish, and every single command post is instantly revealed to the Israeli sensors monitoring from the coast. The Syrians open fire, and dozens of SA-6 missiles roar into the sky, leaving trails of white smoke as the Syrian crews cheer, seeing the explosions and watching the targets disintegrate on their screens, believing they are shooting down the pride of the Israeli Air Force and winning the war in the first 5 minutes. But they are shooting at plastic toys, expending their precious missiles, and overheating their radars to kill model airplanes, painting a giant electronic bullseye on their own foreheads. High above the Mediterranean, the Israeli mission commander aboard an E-2 Hawkeye AWACS aircraft watches the Syrian reaction with cold satisfaction, seeing the data flowing in and realizing the map of the Syrian air defense network is now complete with every frequency logged and every coordinate triangulated. The command is given to launch the second wave, and this time it is not toys. From the ground, Israeli artillery units fire the Ziv anti-radiation missiles, and from the air, F-4 Phantoms operating at low altitude launch their AGM-78s, which are robot assassins with sensors in their noses, tuned to the specific frequency of the SA-6 Gainful radar. The Syrian radar operators suddenly realize that something is wrong, as their screens show missiles coming directly at them at supersonic speeds, and the Soviet advisors scream at them to turn off the radars, yelling, "Shut it down," because if the radar is off, the missile loses its lock. But it is too late because the missiles are already in their terminal phase, and even if the radar is cut, the missiles have a memory function, remembering where the signal was coming from. The first explosions rip through the valley not as small pops of drones being hit, but as massive earth-shaking detonations, as the warheads of the anti-radiation missiles slam into the delicate radar antennas, and the control vans filled with electronics, and men tearing through the soft aluminum skins of the guidance trailers, and erupting fires in the missile storage bunkers. One by one, the eyes of the Syrian air defense network are poked out as the SA-6 battery near the Beirut-Damascus highway goes silent. The SA-2 battery on the ridge is vaporized, and the SA-3 site guarding the flank is turned into a smoking crater. Inside the Syrian command bunker, confusion turns to panic as the screens go blank and the radio channels fill with static, and the screams of dying crews leaving the Soviet advisors stunned as they check their equipment and cables, unable to believe that their system, the impenetrable umbrella, is collapsing, and being dismantled piece by an enemy they cannot even see. But the Israelis are not done, because the destruction of the radars was just the preamble, and the main event is about to begin. With the missile threat neutralized, the airspace over the Bekaa Valley is now open, transformed from a fortress into a killing field. The Israeli Air Force sends in the heavy hitters, the F-15 Eagles and the F-16 Fighting Falcons, the fourth-generation fighters. The planes the Soviets fear the most, carrying air-to-air missiles and waiting. The Syrian High Command, blinded and desperate, plays its final card. Having lost their shield, they must use their sword, so they order the Syrian Air Force to scramble every available fighter jet. From air bases deep inside Syria, hundreds of MiG-21s and MiG-23s roar down the runways, piloted by brave men flying into a technological meat grinder, because they are trained to rely on ground control intercept, needing a voice in their ear, telling them where to fly, but the ground controllers are blind, and their radars are burning wrecks. As the Syrian MiGs cross the border into Lebanon, they are flying into a vacuum, having no situational awareness, with their own radars being jammed by Israeli electronic warfare planes, making them deaf, dumb, and blind. And waiting for them, circling high above in the sun, like hawks waiting for field mice, are the F-15s and F-16s, whose pilots can see everything, thanks to their AWACS plane giving them a god's eye view of the battlefield, watching the Syrian formations struggling to find their bearings. The trap has been sprung perfectly, the bait was taken, the shield has been shattered, and now the slaughter is about to begin, leaving the Soviet advisors watching their screens flicker and die, realizing with a sinking feeling in their stomachs that the war is lost before the first pilot has even pulled the trigger, witnessing the death of an era and the birth of a new terrifying form of warfare, where information is more lethal than explosives. The destruction of the surface-to-air missile batteries was only the opening act of the tragedy, because as the smoke from the burning radars drifted across the valley floor, the Syrian High Command, in a state of desperate fury, ordered their entire air force to launch, believing that sheer numbers could turn the tide against the Israeli technology. From airfields across Syria, nearly 100 MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters scrambled into the air, flying blindly into a kill box that had been meticulously prepared by the Israeli Air Force, and the ensuing battle would go down in history not as a dogfight, but as a massacre, a modern-day equivalent of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of World War II. To understand why this was such a slaughter, one must look inside the cockpits of the opposing aircraft to see the disparity that the Soviet advisors had ignored. The Syrian pilot in his Soviet-built MiG-23 Flogger was sitting in a machine designed for a different era, with a cockpit cluttered with analog dials and a radar that was powerful but primitive, struggling to pick out targets against the ground clutter of the mountains. Most critically, he was a slave to the Soviet doctrine of ground control intercept, relying on a controller sitting in a bunker miles away to tell him where to fly and when to shoot. But those controllers were blind, because their radars had been jammed or destroyed by the Israeli electronic warfare assault, so the Syrian pilots were flying into combat with no eyes, no ears, and no orders. In stark contrast, the Israeli pilot in his F-15 Eagle or F-16 Falcon was sitting in a digital cockpit with a heads-up display projecting flight data directly onto the glass canopy, and a radar that could look down and shoot down distinguishing enemy aircraft from the background noise of the earth, while being supported by the E-2 Hawkeye AWACS, which acted as a quarterback in the sky, vectoring him onto the blind side of the enemy, meaning the Israelis were playing chess, while the Syrians were playing blind man's bluff. The engagement began at long range with the F-15 Eagles carrying the ACU-AM-7 Sparrow radar, guided missiles engaging the Syrians from miles away, so the Syrian pilots never saw the missiles coming because their radar warning receivers, which were primitive and likely jammed, failed to alert them. One moment they were flying in formation, and the next moment their wingman was a fireball disintegrating without a sound. Those Syrian pilots who managed to survive the initial barrage and close to visual range found themselves in an even worse predicament, because they were facing the F-16 Fighting Falcon, a jet that could turn so tightly it crushed the pilot into his seat, with 9 Gs of force, while the MiG-21 and MiG-23 were fast, but clumsy in a turning fight. The Israelis also introduced a secret weapon that the Soviets had not anticipated, the AIM-9L Sidewinder missile, because previous generations of heat-seeking missiles could only be fired from behind the enemy, chasing the hot exhaust of the engine. But the AIM-9L was an all-aspect missile capable of being fired from the front, from the side, or from any angle. The Israeli pilots didn't need to get on the tail of the MiG, they just had to look at it and pull the trigger, while the Syrian pilots, following obsolete Soviet tactics, tried to maneuver to protect their tails, unaware that death was coming from their faces. The sky over the Bekaa Valley became a chaotic swirl of contrails, smoke, and falling debris. But it was a one-sided chaos, where the Israeli radios were calm, disciplined, and efficient, while the Syrian radios were a cacophony of panic and confusion, with pilots screaming for vectors that never came, and formations breaking apart in terror. Some Syrian pilots, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, simply jettisoned their weapons and ran for the border, while others fought bravely, turning their heavy jets to face the nimble American machines, only to be swatted out of the sky with contemptuous ease. By the end of the day, the numbers were staggering, because the Israelis claimed to have shot down 29 Syrian jets in the first wave alone, and by the end of the campaign, the total would rise to 82 confirmed kills, while the number of Israeli aircraft lost in air-to-air combat was 0, making the score 82-0. It was a statistical anomaly so extreme that Western intelligence agencies initially doubted the reports, assuming the Israelis were exaggerating. But when the gun camera footage was analyzed and the wreckage on the ground was counted, the truth was undeniable. The shockwave of this defeat traveled instantly to Moscow, shaking the Soviet military establishment to its core, because for decades they had told themselves that their equipment was roughly equal to the West, believing that their MiGs were rugged and reliable, and that their sheer numbers would overwhelm the sophisticated but fragile American technology. The Bekaa Valley proved that quantity has no quality against absolute technological dominance. The Soviet Chief of Staff Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov was reportedly white-faced when he read the after-action reports, because the humiliation was absolute, as their best export customers, armed with their best weapons and trained in their best tactics, had been obliterated in an afternoon. In a desperate attempt to save face, the Soviet Union sent a high-level delegation to Syria to investigate the disaster, led by Colonel General Yevgeny Yurasov, who arrived in Damascus to find the Syrian Air Force in a state of mutiny. The Syrian pilots blamed the planes, screaming at the Soviet generals, calling the MiGs garbage and coffin boxes, demanding to know why their radars didn't work, why their missiles missed, and why they were blind. The Soviet delegation publicly blamed the Syrians, claiming the Arab pilots were incompetent, and that they had abandoned their training and failed to maintain the equipment. But privately, the Soviet generals were terrified because they knew the truth. They examined the wreckage of the captured Israeli drones and unexploded missiles, and realized that the Americans had leaped a generation ahead in microelectronics, because the Soviets were still using vacuum tubes and analog circuits, while the Americans were using microchips and digital data links. This realization triggered a crisis of confidence within the Kremlin, as they realized that if a war broke out in Europe, the result would be the same as in Lebanon, meaning the thousands of Soviet tactical aircraft stationed in East Germany would not be a tidal wave, they would be targets. The massive investment in the Red Army's air defense umbrella was effectively worthless, because the concept of the electronic battlefield had arrived, and the Soviet Union was fighting with stone tools. The Bekaa Valley Turkey Shoot was not just a battle, it was a turning point in the Cold War that convinced the United States that their high-tech investments in the F-15, F-16, and AWACS were paying off, encouraging the Reagan administration to push harder against the Soviet Union, knowing that the Russian bear was toothless in the sky. Inside the Soviet Union, it sowed the seeds of doubt that would eventually contribute to the collapse of the empire, because they could build thousands of tanks and planes, but they could not build the microchips needed to make them fight. The legacy of that day is still felt in modern air combat, as the dominance established by the F-15 and F-16 over the Bekaa Valley set the standard for air superiority that remains to this day. The F-15 Eagle holds a combat record of 104 wins and 0 losses, a record largely built on the burning carcasses of Soviet MiGs in the Middle East. For the Russian military-industrial complex, the ghost of the Bekaa Valley still haunts them because every time a Russian jet is shot down in a modern conflict, the echoes of 1982 return, a reminder that in the unforgiving arena of the sky, second best is just a fancy way of saying dead. As the sun set over Lebanon on that June evening, the smoke from the burning Syrian aircraft mixed with the dust of the valley, and the Israeli jets returned to their bases, their ammunition drums empty, their pilots exhausted but triumphant, having not just won a battle, but proven a thesis. They had proven that in the age of the microchip, the old Soviet way of war based on mass and brute force was extinct, and that the dinosaur had been killed by the meteor, and it didn't even know it was dead yet. This battle marked the definitive end of the idea that Soviet equipment was equal to American equipment, and it forced the Soviets into a technological race they could not win, and could not afford, a race that would eventually bankrupt their economy and dissolve their union. The smoke over the Bekaa Valley cleared, but the geopolitical fog it generated lingered for decades, because the total destruction of the Syrian air defense network was not just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe for the Soviet Union. For 30 years, the Kremlin had used arms sales as a primary tool of diplomacy, courting nations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, with the promise that Soviet weapons were rugged, simple, and capable of defeating Western imperialism. But the images of burning MiGs and shattered SAM sites in Lebanon destroyed that brand overnight. Countries like India, Iraq, and Libya began to ask uncomfortable questions, realizing that if the best Soviet equipment could be erased in 2 hours by a handful of American jets, then they had no chance in a real war. The Soviet military export market collapsed, costing the struggling Soviet economy billions of dollars in hard currency just as oil prices were beginning to fall, creating an economic blow that accelerated the bankruptcy of the communist state. Inside the Kremlin, the reaction was a mix of denial and panic, where the hardliners argued that the Syrians were to blame, claiming they were Arabs who couldn't fight, but the technocrats knew better. They launched a massive industrial espionage effort trying to steal the secrets of American microprocessors and radar technology, realizing that the gap between East and West was no longer measured in years, but in generations, because while Soviet factories were still hand-soldering circuit boards, American factories were printing microchips with lasers. The Soviet Union attempted to respond by developing the S-300 missile system and the Su-27 flanker fighter, heavily inspired by the American F-15, but they were chasing a ghost, because by the time they fielded these weapons, the Americans had already moved on to stealth technology. The Bekaa Valley had convinced the United States that high-tech was the answer, and they poured money into the LF-117 and the B-2 Spirit, leaving the Soviets bankrupt in the dust. The legacy of the F-15 Eagle was cemented in the skies over Lebanon, because before 1982, the Eagle was a promising but unproven platform, but after 1982, it was the undisputed king of the sky. The combat record of the F-15 stands today at 104 confirmed kills and 0 losses in air-to-air combat, a statistic that defies probability, meaning that in 50 years of service across multiple wars, no enemy pilot has ever managed to shoot down an Eagle. The psychological impact of this dominance cannot be overstated, because during the Cold War, Soviet pilots were trained to believe they were the vanguard of the revolution. But after 1982, they knew deep down that if they met an F-15, they were flying a coffin, creating an erosion of morale that is a poison that kills an air force from the inside out. But perhaps the most haunting echo of the Bekaa Valley is heard today on the battlefields of Ukraine, where 40 years after the Israelis dismantled the Soviet air defense network, the Russian Air Force, the direct inheritor of the Soviet legacy, finds itself in a similar paralysis. Despite having hundreds of modern aircraft like the Su-35 and the Su-34, Russia has failed to establish air superiority over Ukraine because the lessons of 1982 were ignored. The Russian doctrine still relies on rigid top-down control, and their pilots still lack the autonomy and training of their Western counterparts, while their radars are still vulnerable to electronic jamming and anti-radiation missiles, meaning the ghost of Mole Cricket 19 is alive and well. The Russian generals watching their jets fall from the sky in 2022 are suffering the same shock as the Soviet advisors in 1982, realizing that having a big air force on paper means nothing if you cannot blind the enemy and control the electronic spectrum. The operation in 1982 also fundamentally changed the way the West fights war, because it proved the concept of CIA suppression of enemy air defenses. Before, Bekaa planners assumed that high losses were inevitable, and they expected to lose dozens of planes to destroy a SAM site. But the Israelis proved that with the right combination of drones, jamming, and precision missiles, you could take apart a defense network with surgical precision and zero casualties. This became the blueprint for Operation Desert Storm in 1991. When the U.S. Air Force rolled into Iraq, they didn't use brute force. They used the Israeli playbook on a massive scale, blinding Saddam's radars, jamming his communications, and slaughtering his air force on the ground and in the air. The swift victory in the Gulf War, which finally broke the Soviet will to compete, was the direct child of the lessons learned in a small valley in Lebanon 9 years earlier. As we look back at the history of aerial warfare, Mole Cricket 19 stands as the moment the jet age matured into the information age, marking the end of the romantic era of the dogfight, where pilot skill alone could win the day, and the beginning of the era of systems warfare, where the side with the best sensors, the best data links, and the best computers wins before the pilots even see each other. The Syrian pilots who died on that June afternoon were not cowards. They were victims of a technological tsunami they could not comprehend, fighting a 20th century war against a 21st century opponent. The laughter of the Soviet generals in the 1970s, the arrogance of the missile enthusiasts who claimed the manned fighter was dead, was silenced forever by the roar of the F-15s and F-16s over Lebanon, teaching them a brutal lesson that technology without philosophy is useless, and that mass without intelligence is just a target-rich environment. Today, the rusted hulls of the Syrian MiGs have long since been scrapped, but the lesson remains in the unforgiving arena of modern war. If you cannot control the invisible spectrum of electrons, you will inevitably lose the visible battle of steel and fire, making the Bekaa Valley a graveyard of Soviet ambition and a monument to the day the Russian bear looked up and realized it had no claws.